I used to dream a lot. Not in the childish sense of wanting fame or luxury or some perfect future version of myself, but in a very ordinary human way. I used to imagine where my life was going, how it would unfold over time, how effort would eventually turn into stability, how today would logically connect to tomorrow, and how tomorrow would, in turn, slowly build something that could be called a future. And then the war started. I live in Ukraine and I've lived here throughout the war, and I want to say this very clearly from the beginning. I'm not here to talk about politics or to convince anyone of anything or to argue about blame, ideology, or narratives. Because this video isn't about opinions, it's about what prolonged, unavoidable violence does to the human mind when it stops being an abstract concept and becomes a constant background of your existence. The first days of the war were not heroic, not meaningful or cinematic. They were pure panic, hysteria, and physical terror, the kind that hijacks your body before your mind even has time to process. What's happening where you don't think in sentences but in impulses, where sleep disappears, time dissolves, and your nervous system exists in a permanent state of emergency. At first, like many people, I thought this would end quickly because the human mind desperately clings to the idea that reality is fundamentally reasonable, that suffering has limits, that chaos is temporary, and then, slowly, painfully, you realize the war doesn't actually end in the way we imagine. Because even when explosions become less frequent, something inside you has already shifted permanently. One of the first things war took from me was my ability to plan. Not because I became pessimistic or depressed or lazy, but because planning requires a belief in continuity, a belief that if you do A, then B will follow tomorrow and C in a year. And war completely destroyed that internal logic, replacing it with a much colder, much quieter understanding that tomorrow is not guaranteed, that effort does not always lead to outcome, and that existence itself is far more fragile than we like to admit. My house was damaged. Not destroyed, not dramatically, just damaged enough to remind me very calmly and very efficiently that the line between normal life and complete collapse is far thinner than we ever want to believe. And once you internalize that, your brain stops thinking in years, then in months, and eventually even days start to feel like an optimistic unit of measurement. I live now with the awareness that I might not wake up tomorrow, and the strangest part is not that this thought terrifies me, but that it doesn't. At some point, emotions began to disappear, not sadness or joy specifically, but intensity itself. Fear was the first thing to go, then excitement, then attachment, until what remained was a strange, almost sterile calm that I didn't recognize as myself. And that frightened me precisely because of how rational and emotionless it felt. I no longer fear death. And if I'm honest, that scares me more than fear ever did. Because when death becomes a constant background noise, when sirens, explosions, news, and loss stop being exceptional, your nervous system adapts, not by becoming brave, but by becoming quiet, restrained, emotionally economical, as if conserving energy for something undefined but inevitable. War also fundamentally changed how I think about fate. I don't believe in it romantically or spiritually or in a comforting way, but logically, almost mathematically, because once you see enough people flee danger only to die elsewhere, once you see survival and death distributed so randomly and so unfairly, you begin to understand that control was always an illusion, and that if your fate is to die, you will die on another continent just as easily as here. And paradoxically, that realization is freeing. It strips away unnecessary fear, unnecessary striving, and unnecessary illusions about control, success, and security, and replaces them with a much simpler principle. You live because you're alive today, not because the future owes you anything. One of the most difficult parts of this transformation is interacting with people who haven't experienced this kind of rupture in reality. People who still speak fluently in the language of motivation, productivity, optimization, long term vision, and abstract self improvement, as if the world itself hasn't already demonstrated how fragile those frameworks are. Word doesn't make you smarter, but it makes you intolerant to bullshit. You begin to hear manipulation in tone, not words, to recognize emptiness behind confidence, to sense when someone is selling an illusion rather than describing reality. Because once illusions collapse violently, you never fully trust them again. I used to believe in God. In the first 2 months of the war, I prayed every day, not out of the habit or tradition, but out of desperation, because when reality breaks this violently, the human mind instinctively searches for meaning, order, or at least an explanation that doesn't reduce everything to randomness and cruelty. And then I stopped. Not because I was angry and not because I wanted to rebel, but because belief stopped making intellectual sense to me. Because if God exists and allowed this level of suffering to unfold indiscriminately, that faith becomes less an answer and more a refusal to see reality clearly. Word doesn't change people, it reveals them. It removes layers of social performance, moral decoration, and comforting narratives, leaving behind something far more raw and far more honest: cruelty, courage, indifference, compassion, fear, and silence, all stripped of context and justification. I don't know if what happened to me is healing or damage. I don't know if losing the ability to dream is a loss or a form of clarity. All I know is that war woke me up, and once you wake up, dreaming the same way becomes impossible. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's simply the price of seeing reality without filters.